We know that Caesarea was the most beautiful city that Herod has ever built. We know that Herod built a lot of cities, he built a lot of palaces. You know what was the most beautiful building that he has ever built? The temple in Jerusalem. In terms of buildings, that was the most beautiful building he has ever built, and we will get to talk about the temple and how it was built when we go to Jerusalem. But in terms of cities, this was the most beautiful city, simply because it took him 12 years to build Caesarea. And he built it on the highest standards of that times, with Roman theater, with amphitheater, with the hippodrome, palaces, temples. So Caesarea was destroyed and rebuilt quite a few times. As I told you, during the first Jewish revolt, it was rebuilt. It was completely destroyed one more time in the year 642. And after the defeat of the Crusaders in 1291, Caesarea was one more time destroyed by the Muslims. And it remained in ruins until 1517. When the Ottomans took over, they brought some Muslims from Bosnia and they placed them at Caesarea. And those Muslims stayed over here until 1948. After the Independence War, when the site became under the National Parks Authority, they were forced to leave. But if you look at these stones, for example, this one, you'll get to see the crosses. Okay? This is the marble that Herod imported from Greece and was used to decorate. But of course, he did not have the crosses. So when later on during the Byzantine period, they built churches and they reused these stones. This is what we call the Jerusalem cross. In biblical times, in ancient times, there were two major empires that controlled the whole ancient world. The first one was Egypt in the south of here. The second major one was what we call Asia Minor, which is this one, or Mesopotamia. Those were the two empires that controlled the whole ancient world. The only connection between those two empires was this piece of land, which is Israel. Of course, this is Jordan. Okay, here is Jordan. But back at that time, all the caravans couldn't go through Jordan because that was the desert, and they traveled back at that time for weeks and months, and they couldn't travel through the desert. So the trade route that connected those two major empires together, and those two empires really needed each other, was this piece of land. There were two major roads that went through Israel and connected those two empires together. The most important one and the number one trade route in biblical times was what we call the Via Maris, the way of the sea, that came from Egypt along the Mediterranean, passing by Caesarea all the way up north towards the city of Megiddo, where we are going to today. Then from Megiddo towards the Sea of Galilee, the town of Capernaum, and then up north to what we call nowadays Damascus. That was like the most important route. The second one was what we call the Patriarch's Highway. It's called the Patriarch's Highway because it's the path that the patriarch Abraham took back and forth in Genesis chapter 14 when he came from the south all the way up to a place called Tel Dan, or the Canaanite town of Lashem, to rescue his nephew Lot that was captured over here and was taken as a prisoner. So he came all the way from the south following that path that we call nowadays the Patriarch's Highway, which went through Hebron, Jerusalem, Samaria, then passed by Mount Carmel, Mount Tabor, Sea of Galilee, up north to Damascus. Those were the two major trade routes that controlled the two major empires in biblical times, which means that back at that time, whoever controlled this piece of land controlled the whole ancient world. And that's why everybody fought over the control of this piece of land. Back at that time, there were different ways of burying people. Like wealthy people, members of the royal families, high-ranked soldiers were buried in these kind of fancy tombs. Like it's a big stone that would be chiseled out. The body would be laid in it. They'll close the tomb, never reopen it after that. So one tomb for one person. See over there, you see an older one. This is 5th century. According to the Greek inscription, it says that Procopius, the deacon of Caesarea, was buried over here. But that's an older one. Now for poor people, back at that time, they used what we call family burial places. A family burial place is a 1st century cave. Inside the cave, people would dig horizontal shafts, different ones, based on the size of the family. When a member of the family dies, they'll bury him in one of those horizontal shafts. The rolling stone would be outside. So you go through the main entrance, the first door, into a chamber, which is the place for the preparations, and then you have the horizontal shafts inside. When all the shafts, all the tombs inside are used, and a member of that same family dies, they won't dig another horizontal shaft. What they'll do, they'll open one of the tombs, take the bones out, put them in ossuaries, stone boxes, keep the box inside the tomb, and bury another person. Each tomb was used for 7 people. They could use each tomb for 7 people. And this helps us nowadays to determine the size of the families back at that time. So like if you find a burial place that goes back to the 1st century with 5 horizontal shafts, this means that that family had about 35 people. 5 by 7, 35 people, average 35, 30, or 40 people. So this helps us determine the size of the families back at that time. But for those fancy people, wealthy people, members of the royal families were buried in these kind of tombs. What you see here, this is a replica of the stone that was used as one of the seats of the Roman theater with the inscription on it. This is how the inscription looks like, which is this one over here. And the translation of it, Pontius Pilatus, the prefect of Judea, built or erected a temple dedicated to the Emperor Tiberius. So this was the only mention of Pilate outside the Gospels, the scriptures, until that ring was found at Herodion. This was found at the Roman theater, but they brought it over here to Herod's palace. So this is the upper level of Herod's palace. We're going to see the lower level of Herod's palace. His private swimming pool. Because when we talk about Herod, we talk about mainly 2 things. We talk about brutality and we talk about luxurious life. So he built these fancy palaces, and you will get to see when we go to Masada how magnificent the city of Masada is, the one that he built. He was never at Masada. He never lived at Masada. As people say, that he never even went to Masada after it was built. But he was the one that, wanted to show his greatness by building these magnificent palaces and cities. And so at his palace at Caesarea, instead of building a swimming pool, he decided to chisel it out in the natural rock. And then he surrounded the pool by a wall. It was kind of enclosed, private. And then he covered all the area around the pool by this mosaic floor that you see over here. So this was the private swimming pool of Herod the Great when he came to Caesarea. We are going to see a similar one when we go to his summer palace in Bethlehem, Herodion. We will get to see the private swimming pool of Herod the Great. You can see the ruins or what was left of the walls. Now exactly, guys, underneath us is most probably where the prison was. The prison at Caesarea was underneath Herod's palace. And this is where most probably the Apostle Paul spent the last 2 years of his life, over here at that prison, underground prison. And after 2 years, he decided to appeal to Caesar. Now then, when he made his appeal, he had to be at the palace. If you look over here, you see this elevated area? That's where the seat of the king was. That's where the king received all his guests, listened to any complaints, any issues. He had to be seated at his seat at that elevated area. Which means that when the Apostle Paul made the appeal to receive a trial, he had to make the appeal over here in front of the king at Herod's palace. And this was, his appeal was approved. And then from here he was taken to Rome. So from the prison he made the appeal. Then after approving the appeal, he was taken back to the prison. Then from here to the ship at Herod's harbor and on to Rome, where he was executed. Which means that this was the last thing that the Apostle Paul had seen before he left to his execution to Rome. So what do you see over here? We're going to walk through it. This is the hippodrome, which was mainly for horses and chariots races. And this could host about 10,000 people. This is original from the time of Herod the Great. And of course it was much higher. The stage was a little bit higher. And so this could host 10,000 people on it. It was also used mainly for entertainment. Now when people came to these shows at the hippodrome, they needed to go to the bathroom. These are the public toilets. Seriously.
You sit in between the rocks?
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Where does it go then?
See a channel? I told you when I told you that Herod had a sewage system. So the channel would take it all the way to the sea. So these were the public toilets. What you need to know is that the public bathrooms and public toilets back at that time, like it was a place where people would gather and socialize. Seriously. And we will see this clearly when we go to Beit Shean. At the bathhouses over there, that's where people met and they talked and they socialized. So these were the public toilets of the hippodrome. It was a wide street. On both sides of the street there were shops. It was the main market area of that Roman city. When we go to Jerusalem, we're going to see the Cardo. That was built by Emperor Hadrian in the year 135. After the second Jewish revolt, when he decided to Romanize the city of Jerusalem. So there was one. The second one was what was called the Decumanus, the one that divided the Roman city east-west. If you look over here, see this Roman road, the street? This is the Decumanus that divided Caesarea east-west. And it meets with the Cardo by the fence. You see the fence way there? So whenever you see the arches, that means that it's Middle Ages, because the Crusaders were famous of building these arches. So this is typical Crusader. You see the L-shaped entrance, the L-shaped gate. Crusaders, most of the times, built their gates this way in an L shape, and this was one type of defense. Simply, because back at that time, warriors carried the shield with their left hand and the sword with the right hand. So just in case if the enemies destroy the door and they are about to come in, when they get to this point over here, they had to make a right turn. When they made that right turn, holding the shield with their left hand, the right side of their body is unprotected, unguarded. And so archers would be standing over there to hit them on the right side. So some of the doors of Jerusalem were designed this way by the Ottomans in an L shape, but mainly the Crusaders always designed these L-shaped entrances.
It is now still original, right?
Original, Middle Ages, yeah. Yeah, so enemies would come through the door, get to this point, they had to slow down before they made that right turn. And then they made that right turn, right side of their body is unprotected.
Alright, so behind us we have an aqueduct. Herod the Great built this aqueduct to provide fresh water for his city he made called Caesarea. This aqueduct is about 5 miles in length, carrying water from the closest mountain spring to the city. And all an aqueduct is basically a water trough that provides a channel to flow the water to wherever it needs to go.
The people in Jerusalem worshiped the god Moloch, and they had a big temple in Jerusalem for the god Moloch, where they offered human sacrifices for him. People believed back at that time that if you sacrifice your firstborn to that god, the god would be satisfied. When we go to Jerusalem, we're going to see the Gehenna Valley, which is the Hell Valley. It's called the Hell Valley because of that. Because in that valley there was the temple of the god Moloch. In front of the temple there was an altar with fire going on 24/7. And people came from everywhere holding their babies, their firstborns, and they would burn them at the altar in front of the temple of the god Moloch, because they believed that that satisfied him. And so that was practiced back at that time. Different gods, different ways of worshiping those gods, and we will get to talk about other gods later on. But the main one was Baal Haddad. One of the biggest centers of worship of that god was Megiddo, the town of Megiddo, which is at the foot of Mount Carmel, where we are going next. And we're going to see the altar where they offered these sacrifices. So the prophet Elijah tried over and over to convince King Ahab and Queen Jezebel to stop or to cease that kind of worship. They never listened to him. At the end, he went to them and he said, okay, let's see whose God is the true God, the real God. If it's your God, the God Baal, let everybody worship him. But if it's the God that I worship, the God of Israel, the Lord, let everybody worship that one God. And Queen Jezebel agreed to that. And they decided to have a challenge on top of Mount Carmel. The challenge was to build 2 altars, one for Queen Jezebel and one for the prophet Elijah. And the challenge was to bring the sacrifice to the altar and to call for each god to answer. The one who answers by fire from heavens to consume the sacrifice is the true God. So we know that Queen Jezebel gathered 450 prophets of the god Baal to the top of Mount Carmel. They built their altar. They brought the sacrifice, and they spent the whole day calling for their God to answer them. There was no answer. By the end of the day, the prophet Elijah started to make fun of them, and we will get to read about that in a minute. When it was Elijah's turn, he brought 12 stones, the 12 tribes of Israel. He built his altar, he brought the sacrifice, he cut it into pieces, and he placed it on the altar, and he prayed for the Lord to manifest himself. And that was when fire came down from heavens, consumed the sacrifice and the altar. And everybody who was on Mount Carmel believed in the prophet Elijah and the God of Israel. After that, Elijah told everybody over here to take the 450 prophets of Baal to the foot of Mount Carmel, to a place called the Kishon, which is at the foot of this mountain, and they slaughtered them all. They slaughtered the 450 prophets of Baal. That was when Queen Jezebel started to chase Prophet Elijah to revenge the killing of the 450 prophets. And we will get to talk also more about that. That's why inside the church over here, if you look at the altar of the church, they have a small church, but the altar of the church was built by 12 stones, representing the altar that the prophet Elijah built over here on top of the mountain.
Thank you, Rami. From 1 Kings chapter 18. So Ahab sent to all the people of Israel and gathered the prophets together at Mount Carmel. And Elijah came near to all the people and said, How long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. And the Lord did not answer him a word. Then Elijah said to the people, even I only am left a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. Let 2 bulls be given to us, and let them choose 1 bull for themselves, and cut it in pieces and lay it on the wood. But put no fire to it. And I will prepare the other bull and lay it to the wood, and put no fire to it. And you call upon the name of your God, and I will call upon the name of the Lord, and the God who answers by fire. He is God. And all the people answered, It is well spoken. Then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, Choose for yourselves 1 bull and prepare it first, for you are many, and call upon the name of your God, and put no fire to it. And they took the bull that was given to them, and they prepared it, and called upon the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, O Baal, answer us. But there was no voice. And then down in verse 30, And Elijah said to all the people, Come now to me. And all the people came near to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been thrown down. Elijah took 12 stones according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord came, saying, Israel shall be your name. And with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he made a trench about the altar, as great as would contain 2 seahs of seed. And he put the wood in order, and cut the bull in pieces, and laid it on the wood. And he said, Fill 4 jars with water, and put it on the burnt offering, and on the wood. And he said, Do it a second time. And they did it a second time. He said, Do it a third time. They did it a third time. And the water ran around the altar, and filled the trench also with the water. And at the time of the offering, the oblation, Elijah the prophet came near and said, O Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. Then the fire of the Lord fell, and consumed the burnt offering, and the wood, and the stones, and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and said, The Lord, He is God, the Lord, He is God. And we're going to have a prayer. But how does this relate to us? And we said the very first day, this is a pilgrimage. And we're all on a pilgrimage together. We're pilgrims. And when a pilgrimage takes place, when the pilgrims would come to Jerusalem, they came to do what? Worship. To experience worship. And we want to hear, we want to see, we want to learn, but most of all, we want to experience Israel. We want to experience God in Israel and feel Him. And here is the site of one of the greatest battles in all of history, the battle at Mount Carmel. And just as God prevailed that day, He still prevails. So the question today, where's the battle? Where is our Mount Carmel? 2 Corinthians chapter 10 says, Though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but are mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations, and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. So where is our Carmel? Where do we need to bring our offering? Where do we need the fire of the Lord to come down to today? Think about your battle. Some of you think you've left some battles back in North Carolina. Some left North Carolina to come to Israel and brought your battles with you. They're still with you. Battles we face: guilt, shame, unforgiveness, anger, bitterness, resentment, jealousy. And it's a spiritual battle. Goes on in our hearts, goes on in our imaginations, like 2 Corinthians chapter 10 says. Ephesians chapter 6, Finally, brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of His might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes, the trickery of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against spiritual wickedness in heavenly places, against demonic activity that brings the battle to our imaginations and to our hearts. So today, let's all just take a couple of minutes before Rami takes us into the church and we get to continue our sites. But let's take a few minutes and think about our own personal battle, because we have been given the opportunity right now at this moment to bring our personal battle to the place where one of the greatest battles ever in all of Bible history was won, when God rained down fire on the offering for Elijah. So with heads bowed and eyes closed, and we're just going to have a moment of silence. I want us all to think about, what battle is in my imagination today, Lord? What battle is in my heart? My personal battle. My personal war.
So what we are looking at over here, this is the Isreal Valley, which is the largest valley in the whole country. It stretches from Mount Carmel, where we are, all the way east towards the Sea of Galilee. So it divides the whole country into two. The name Isreal comes from the two Hebrew words, Jezra, which means to plant, and El, which means God. So the meaning of this valley is God plants. And this is to describe the fertility of this valley. This is the most fertile part of the whole country. And a lot of people would call it the breadbasket of the state of Israel. And it divides the whole country into two. When you read about Samaria, Samaria is south of the valley of Jezreel. It's not so clear, but not far away from here. Down there, that's Samaria. Galilee is over there. I don't know if you can notice it from here, but if you look that direction over there, you see way far in the horizon the top of a mountain, a round mountain. Do you see that? That is Mount Tabor, or Tabor, which was identified as the site of the Transfiguration, but we'll get to talk about that. But that mountain controlled the Patriarch's Highway. When I told you about the two major roads that connected Egypt with Asia Minor, the city of Megiddo, which is at the foot of this mountain down there where we are going, controlled the Via Maris, the most important road. Mount Tabor controlled the Patriarch's Highway, which is the second important road. I told that the caravans between those two empires had to take back at that time, which means that whoever controlled the city of Megiddo and Mount Tabor controlled the two routes that connected those two empires together, which meant back at that time a lot of money, a lot of power. Technically, in other words, in biblical times, that meant controlling the whole ancient world by controlling those two roads. And that's the reason why everybody, since the beginning of history, fought over the control of the city of Megiddo and Mount Tabor. You read Judges chapter 4 and 5, it tells us about the famous story between the Canaanites and the Israelites at the foot of Mount Tabor over there. So most of the battles that were fought over the control of this piece of land were fought over the control of those two sides. And so all those battles were fought in the fields between those two sides, the fields that you are looking at. That's why we say that more blood was shed in this valley than any other place in the world, because all those battles that were fought over the control of this country. But the common belief is that this is the valley of Armageddon. This is where all the armies of the world would gather for the final battle at the end of days. So if you look straight ahead in the valley in front of us, you see that kind of landing area, landing place, the kind of triangle thing. There is a huge underground Air Force base underneath, which was secret. It's not secret anymore. Everybody knows about it. But what happens is that you see the jets landing, and all of a sudden they disappear. There's kind of hydraulics that take them down to that Air Force base. I mean, it's strategic location.
So we're here at the highest point of Mount Carmel, and this is the place where Elijah contested the Baal prophets, 450 Baal prophets, on whether our God or their God was the true God, and it was proven by fire coming from the heavens and consuming Elijah's sacrifice that our God was the true God. And the overlook in this beautiful background is known as the Valley of Armageddon. And
What are the green cabbage looking things?
These are grape leaves.
Grape leaves.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
And they roll like rice or whatever.
You got rice in the middle. Look at that.
26 layers of different civilizations, of different settlements that were built on top of each other. So this artificial mound was formed by the ruins of those settlements. Here, and there is another place which is Jericho, the city of Jericho. That's where they have discovered those over 26 layers of civilizations built on top of each other. And so since the beginning of history, everybody wanted to control the city of Megiddo simply because, as I explained to you, it controlled the Via Maris, the way of the sea. Megiddo is considered to be one of the most important archaeological sites because of this. But what happened back at that time, when the enemies or the conquerors would destroy a city or take over a city, what they'll do, the first thing they'll do is to destroy the walls and the gates of that city, and on top of that build their own walls and gates. Gates were so important in biblical times. It had a big significance, an important significance. That's why, if you remember what happened at Caesarea Philippi, when Jesus talked to Peter and he told him, the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. So gates had a big significance back at that time. We know that Megiddo was one of what we call the chariot cities of King Solomon. It was one of the cities that King Solomon fortified, and this is where he had about 450 horses. This is where he trained his horses. So as we walk up, we're going to pass by steps. Those steps connected the city with the spring, or the water that came from the spring. And those steps go back to the Iron Age. So we talk about 3,000 years old. At the time of King Solomon, we're gonna go a little bit up and see the Bronze Age gates. Bronze Age, I'm talking about 2000 roughly, 2000 BCE. So those would be 4,000 years old, and we'll go up to the top of the mountain. The water system, we're going to walk down about 183 steps. We're gonna walk through that vertical shaft, then walk through the tunnel, which is about 200 feet long, and climb up another 80 steps. The place where they stored all the seeds and the grains. Because in time of war, when the enemies would come and lay siege around the city, the first thing they'll do is to cut off the water supplies and the food supplies from the inhabitants to force them to surrender.
As Romney was referring to, he was referring to John, and specifically John chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. On the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Now both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. And when they ran out of wine, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." That in no way was a disrespect. That was a terminology of that day and time. And actually, he was speaking to his mother in a respectful way, not a disrespectful way. But of course, he was referring to the fact that his hour had not yet come, which was what he was, yes, and what he was called to do. But here's one of the greatest pieces of advice in the entire Word of God. And this is what I would like for all of us to take away from this particular site. His mother said to the servants, "Whatever he says to you, do it." And would to God that we could all do that. What great advice to take from Mary. Whatever he says, whenever he tells us something in our hearts that we need to do it. Now there were set there 6 water pots of stone according to the manner of purification of the Jews, containing 20 or 30 gallons apiece. Jesus said to them, "Fill the water pots with water," and they filled them to the brim. And he said to them, "Draw some out now and take it to the master of the feast." And they took it. When the master of the feast had tasted the water, that it was made wine, and did not know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew it, the master of the feast called the bridegroom, and he said to him, "Every man at the beginning sets out the good wine, and when the guests have well drunk, then the inferior. You have kept the good wine until now." This beginning of signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So there's our story.
When in the Gospel of John, it says that when his mother realized that there was no more wine, she came to him. Till today. So when his mother came to him and she told him, "We have no more wine," that was a big issue back at that time, because it's a dishonor for that whole family. And again, what did he tell her? "I have nothing to do with this." And what he called her? Woman. Many people would understand this, as Pastor David said, as a very rude way to address a mother. But back at that time, that was not. That was the most respectful way of addressing a mother in front of other men, for 2 reasons. The first one is that back at that time, people would never ever share the names of their females, a mother, a sister, a daughter, or a wife, in front of other men, which is the case still today. If you go to any Muslim village nowadays and you see a woman walking down the street and you ask the villagers, "Who is this woman?" you will never get to know her name. Never ever. As a stranger, they'll never tell you. They will tell you, "This is the wife of so-and-so," or "This is the mother of," or "the daughter," or "the sister of." But they will never tell you her name, because that's part of our culture, that conservative culture. That this is one of the jars, one of the 6 jars that Jesus asked the servants to fill with water. And I know that when I say a jar, most people would think of those small clay jars, which was not possible back at that time. The Jews couldn't use clay jars at the synagogues, simply because the clay gets unclean. The only thing that remains clean, doesn't get unclean after the first and the second use, is the stone. And that's why they, at the synagogues, they used stone jars, because they could use them over and over. They didn't have to worry about replacing them every now and then. And it says in the Gospel of John that each one of them could take between 20 to 30 gallons. And this one could take between 20 to 30 gallons. So 6 jars by 30 gallons, that's 180 gallons of wine. The estimated number of people to drink that wine is 450 people, which is the estimated number of people who lived at the village of Cana in the 1st century, which means that the entire village was invited to the wedding. But what do you see over here? This is the side of the synagogue. The church, the main church, was built exactly on top of the center of that synagogue, which was most probably in the middle of the town, the village of Cana. But what do you see over here? Also, these are the ruins of that 1st century synagogue at the village of Cana. And since it's the only one that has been discovered at the village of Cana, we assume or we think that the wedding that Jesus was invited to was over here. But if you read the Gospel of John, you get the sense that at Cana was the first time for the disciples to meet Mary. In the Gospels, it was the first time for the disciples to meet Mary was at the wedding feast at Cana.